Rain streaked down the windshield, a steady drumbeat against the quiet hum of jazz spilling from the Bluetooth speaker. Outside Atlanta, Georgia, Interstate 85 stretched out like a black ribbon under the night sky, slick and empty save for the occasional truck rumbling past, headlights slicing through the wet haze. Lieutenant Commander Maya Jackson gripped the wheel, her gray sweater clinging to her shoulders, jeans worn soft from a long day. She was just another driver, or so it seemed. Then a flash of red and blue pierced the rearview mirror, sharp and relentless. Her stomach tightened, not with fear, but with the weight of knowing what might come next. She eased the car onto the shoulder, tires crunching gravel, and waited, hands steady on the wheel. He thought she was just another easy mark to mess with, until she flipped the script and burned his whole world down. The patrol car's lights pulsed behind her, painting the wet asphalt with streaks of red and blue that flickered like a warning in the dark. Maya Jackson kept her hands locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, fingers steady despite the faint tremor of adrenaline starting to creep up her spine. She wasn't new to this game. Hadn't been since the first time she'd been pulled over at 19, a skinny college kid with a beat-up Honda and a cop who didn't like the way she'd asked why. She'd heard the story since she was old enough to listen, from her dad, her cousins, her friends. Hell, she'd lived a few herself. The rain hammered down harder now, a dull roar against the roof of her sedan, drowning out the last notes of the jazz track fading into static. Through the rear view, she watched the patrol car's door swing open, slow and deliberate, like the guy inside wanted her to feel every second of the wait. Heavy boots hit the gravel, crunching loud enough to cut through the storm. A shadow loomed in her side mirror. Broad shoulders, a stiff gait, the kind of walk that screamed authority he hadn't earned. She rolled the window down halfway, just enough to hear him over the rain, and the cold night air rushed in, sharp with the scent of wet earth and gasoline from the highway. Sergeant Tom Carver stood there, his uniform crisp despite the weather, rain beating on the brim of his hat. One hand rested on his belt, thumb hooked near his holster. The other gripped a flashlight he didn't bother turning on yet. His eyes, hard, gray, and narrowed, swept over her like she was roadkill he'd rather leave behind. Up close, he was bigger than she'd figured. 6 foot something, maybe 200 pounds, with a jawline that looked like it had been carved out of stubbornness more than stone. "License and registration," he barked, voice flat and clipped. No trace of courtesy. It wasn't a request. It was an order, the kind he expected obeyed without a second thought. Maya met his stare, her dark eyes unblinking, and reached slowly for the glove compartment. Every move was deliberate, telegraphed. She wasn't about to give him an excuse. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, keeping her tone light, almost conversational, like they were chatting over a diner counter instead of squared off on a rainy highway. She pulled out the papers, license crisp, registration folded neatly, and handed them over, her fingers brushing the edge of the window frame as she passed them through. Carver snatched them up, holding them just out of her reach as he tilted his head to give her car a lazy once-over. The sedan wasn't flashy. Dark blue, a few years old, nothing to catch the eye. "Taillights out," he said, like he'd just solved a crime. His voice carried that smug edge, the kind that dared her to argue. She frowned just enough to show she wasn't swallowing it whole. "That's news to me," she said, still calm, still steady. "Got it checked not long ago. Mechanics said everything was good." She knew damn well the taillights were fine. She'd driven this car from Norfolk to Atlanta without a hiccup, and she wasn't the type to let maintenance slide. Not with her job, not with her life. He finally looked at her, really looked at her, and his lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smirk. More like a predator sizing up prey he didn't expect to bite back. "You arguing with me?" The air shifted, a silent crackle threading through the rain-soaked night. Maya knew this moment too well, had seen it in debriefs overseas, felt it in training exercises meant to steel her for the real world. Power met resistance, and one side always thought the other would cave. She'd faced down bigger threats than this guy, desert patrols with IEDs ticking somewhere out of sight, foreign operatives who'd kill for less than a wrong look. Carver didn't scare her. He pissed her off. "I'm just saying," she replied, voice smooth as still water. "If it's out, I'll get it fixed. No big deal. She leaned back slightly, hands still visible, letting him see she wasn't rattled. "Step out of the car." He cut her off, sharp and final, like her words were nothing but static he could tune out. She paused just a beat, letting his command hang there in the damp air. Her fingers tapped the wheel once, a flicker of movement, a habit from years of keeping her cool under pressure. Then she tilted her head, meeting his gaze again. "Mind telling me why?" Carver's jaw tightened and that half-smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of something harder. Annoyance, maybe, or the thrill of a challenge he hadn't expected. "'Cause I told you to. That's why." His hand slid closer to the cuffs on his belt, metal glinting faintly in the patrol car's lights. A silent threat she clocked without blinking. Maya exhaled slow through her nose, the sound lost in the rain. She weighed her options fast, same as she'd done 100 times before. She could push back, quote the Fourth Amendment chapter and verse, turn this into a standoff he'd lose on paper later. But she knew how these things went. No witnesses, no dash cam she could see, just her word against his on a dark stretch of I-85. She'd been through worse and come out standing. This wasn't the hill to die on. Not yet. She unbuckled her seatbelt, the click loud in the quiet car, and pushed the door open. Rain hit her face as she stepped out, soaking into her sneakers and the hem of her jeans. The asphalt was slick underfoot, but she stood tall, shoulders loose, posture measured, like she was walking into a briefing room, not facing down a badge with an attitude. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she damn sure wasn't about to be bullied. Carver took a step back, sizing her up. 5'7", no uniform, no flash, just a woman in a sweater and jeans standing in the drizzle. He figured he could push her around, same as he'd done a dozen times before. "Turn around, hands on the car." She didn't move right away, letting the rain drip off her chin as she held his gaze. "For what reason?" Her voice stayed low, firm, cutting through the storm like a blade honed sharp. He stepped closer, close enough she could smell the stale coffee on his breath, mixing with the wet leather of his gear. "You resisting?" His tone hardened, a flicker of something, annoyance, excitement, crossing his face as he reached for his radio. "Got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into it, loud enough for her to hear, then barked, "Turn around!" Maya's pulse kicked up, a steady thrum in her ears, but her face didn't show a damn thing. "Officer," she said, slow and deliberate, each word weighted, "I need you to understand something. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and what you can't." That hit him like a slap. His eyes narrowed to slits, knuckles flexing white around the radio. "You're under arrest," he snapped, lunging for her wrist with a speed that caught her off guard. She sidestepped, just enough to dodge his grab, her movements smooth, instinctive. Years of training kicking in without a thought. "Under arrest for what?" "For obstructing an officer." He yanked the cuffs off his belt, metal glinting in the flashing lights, his face twisting with a mix of rage and triumph. Maya let out a sharp breath, almost a laugh, the sound swallowed by the rain. So that was his game. Escalate, fabricate, control. Her heartbeat stayed steady, her breathing even. She could take this further, make him work for it, but she wasn't about to become another hashtag on someone's feed. Not tonight. With slow, deliberate precision, she turned, placing her hands on the cool, wet roof of her car, rain streaking down her arms. Carver didn't waste a second. He yanked her arms back, snapping the cuffs on tight. Too tight, the steel biting into her wrists until she felt the sting of skin breaking. "You don't know who you're messing with, lady," he growled, his breath hot against her ear as he shoved her toward his patrol car. She stumbled once, caught herself on the doorframe, then glanced over her shoulder as he shoved her again. "Funny," she murmured, voice low but clear over the storm. "I was about to say the same thing." He froze just for a split second, her words sinking in like a splinter under his skin. Then he shoved her into the back seat, the hard plastic digging into her spine as he slammed the door with a thud that echoed in the night. Through the partition, she watched him strut back to his vehicle, whistling a tuneless little ditty like he'd just scored a win. Maya shifted her wrists, testing the cuffs, way too tight on purpose, the ache already spreading up her forearms. She leaned back, staring at her faint reflection in the glass. Calm, composed. But underneath, something simmered, hot and steady. Carver thought he had her locked down. He thought wrong. The patrol car lurched forward, tires spitting gravel as it pulled back onto I-85. The red and blue lights still flashing in a rhythm that stained the wet road behind them. Maya Jackson sat pressed against the hard plastic seat, the cuffs biting into her wrists with every jolt. The rain had soaked through her sweater, leaving it clinging cold against her skin, but she barely noticed. Her eyes flicked to the partition separating her from the front. Smudged plexiglass, scratched from years of use, reflecting the faint outline of her face. Calm, composed. She'd been here before, not in this exact back seat, but in moments like it, pinned down, outgunned, waiting for the right play. Through the glass, she could see Tom Carver's silhouette, shoulders squared like he owned the damn highway. He was whistling again, that same tuneless little ditty, the sound grating against the hum of the engine. Every so often, he glanced back at her in the rear view, his gray eyes catching hers for a split second before darting away. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, just held his gaze until he broke it. He thought he'd won something out there in the rain, thought he'd put her in her place. She let him think it. The cuffs were too tight, deliberately so, she knew. The steel edges pressed into her skin, sending a dull ache up her arms. But she kept her breathing steady, in and out, like she'd learned in basic training all those years ago. Control the breath, control the mind. She shifted her wrists slightly, testing them, and felt the sting where the metal had already rubbed her raw. Carver wasn't just sloppy. He was spiteful. She filed that away, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The drive wasn't long, 10, maybe 15 minutes, but it felt endless, the rain smearing the world outside into a blur of headlights and shadows. She thought about the last time she'd been in a spot like this. Not cuffed, but cornered. Some nowhere outpost in Iraq, sand in her boots, an insurgent's rifle trained on her squad. She'd talked her way out of that one, kept her cool when everyone else was losing theirs. This was different, though. This wasn't a war zone. It was home, and that made it worse. The patrol car slowed, pulling into a squat brick building off the highway, a small-time precinct, the kind that smelled like burnt coffee and bad decisions before you even stepped inside. Carver killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the rain's steady drumbeat. He swung his door open, boots hitting the pavement with that same heavy crunch, and yanked hers open a second later. "Let's go," he snapped, grabbing her elbow like she was a kid caught shoplifting. Maya twisted her arm just enough to slip his grip, stepping out on her own terms. The rain hit her again, colder now, dripping off her chin as she straightened up. Her wrists burned, but she kept her head high, shoulders back, moving like she was walking into a briefing room instead of a holding cell. Carver grunted, annoyed, and shoved her toward the entrance, his hand landing hard between her shoulder blades. She didn't stumble this time, just absorbed it, let it fuel the quiet fire building inside her. Inside, the precinct was exactly what she'd expected. Flickering fluorescent lights, a chipped linoleum floor, and a desk sergeant who barely looked up from his crossword as they passed. The air hung heavy with the stale tang of sweat and old coffee grounds, the kind of place where time dragged and paperwork piled up. Carver marched her through booking, fingerprints smudged onto a scanner, a mugshot snapped with a flash that left spots in her vision, his grip on her arm tight enough to bruise. The other cops barely glanced her way, just going through the motions, their indifference a shield for guys like him. She'd seen it before, that quiet complicity. It was why men like Carver thrived. He uncuffed her just long enough to shove her into a holding cell, a 6x8 box with gray walls, a single flickering bulb, and a metal bench bolted to the floor. The door clanged shut behind her, the lock clicking into place with a finality that echoed in the empty space. She sank onto the bench, the cold steel biting through her damp jeans, and rolled her shoulders to ease the stiffness creeping in. Her wrists throbbed, red welts blooming where the cuffs had cut in, but she didn't rub them. Didn't give him that satisfaction, even if he couldn't see her now. Through the bars, she could hear the faint murmur of voices. Carver bullshitting with someone at the front desk, probably spinning his version of the night. She caught snippets. Mouthy, needed to learn. Her jaw tightened, but she stayed still, letting the words wash over her. She'd spent nights in worse spots. Bunkers with no heat, safe houses with no doors. But this was different. This was personal. This was a man with a badge drunk on power, convinced he could do whatever he wanted because he always had. Then the footsteps came back, heavy, arrogant, the same rhythm she'd clocked out on the highway. Carver appeared in front of the cell, arms crossed over his chest, that same not-quite smirk plastered on his face. "Comfy?" he asked, leaning one shoulder against the bars, his voice dripping with mockery. She didn't answer right away, just watched him, letting the silence stretch until it got under his skin. His smirk faltered, just for a second, and she seized it. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, her voice low, steady, laced with something he couldn't quite place. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing like he was trying to figure her out. "You know," he said, stepping closer to the bars, "if you'd just played along out there, you wouldn't be in here right now." She let a slow smile curl at the edges of her lips, sharp enough to cut. "Oh, I'm playing," she said. "Just not your game." That threw him. His smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. There and gone in a blink, covered up fast with a scoff. "No one's coming for you tonight, sweetheart," he said, shrugging like it was a done deal. "Guess you'll have some time to think about that attitude." She leaned forward, just enough to close the distance without moving from the bench, her eyes locking onto his. "And you'll have time to think about what you just stepped in." He laughed, a short, harsh bark, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Big talk for someone behind bar," he shot back, tapping the metal with his knuckles like he was testing it. "Enjoy your stay." He turned on his heel, boots scuffing the floor as he walked away, leaving her in the dim flicker of the cell's lone bulb. Maya exhaled slow, settling back against the wall. The precinct noises faded into a dull hum, phones ringing faintly, a chair scraping somewhere down the hall. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing Carver out there in the rain, smug and clueless, yanking her arms back like he was king of the damn world. She'd seen his type before, entitled, sloppy, so sure the system would catch him if he fell. Then a new sound cut through the haze. Lighter footsteps, hurried, accompanied by the rustle of paper. A younger cop, maybe late 20s, stepped into view, his standard issue uniform hanging loose on a wiry frame. Eric Dawson, his name tag read. He stopped a few feet from the bars, clutching a clipboard, his face tight with something that looked like nerves. Sarge?" he called, voice carrying a hint of hesitation as he glanced down the hall. Carver's boots thudded back into earshot, slower this time. "What?" he snapped, rounding the corner with a scowl. Eric shifted on his feet, eyes darting between the clipboard and Carver. "We got a call," he said, quieter now, like he didn't want her to hear. "From D.C. about her." He nodded toward Maya, barely meeting her gaze. Carver's scowl deepened, but something flickered in his expression. Unease, maybe, buried under the bravado. "Handle it," he growled, waving a hand like it was nothing. Eric didn't budge. They sounded insistent, he pressed, voice dropping lower. "Said to check her name again." Maya stayed still, but her lips twitched. Just a hint of a smile. Carver shot her a look, quick and sharp, like he'd caught it, then turned back to Eric. "Tell him she's booked. End of story." His tone was final, but his knuckles flexed at his sides, betraying him. Eric hesitated, then nodded and shuffled off, clipboard clutched tight. Carver lingered, staring at her through the bars, his jaw working like he wanted to say something else. She stared back, unflinching, letting him stew in it. He muttered something under his breath, too low to catch, then stormed off, his footsteps fading into the precinct's hum. Maya leaned her head back against the wall, the cold grounding her. She didn't need to hear what he'd said. She knew what was coming, and when it hit, Carver wouldn't see it until it was too late. Morning light sliced through the narrow windows of the Fulton County Courthouse, spilling across the polished hardwood floors in long, golden streaks. The air inside was crisp, heavy with the scent of old wood and lemon polish, the kind of cold that sank into your bones if you stood still too long. Maya Jackson didn't stand still. She stood poised near the defendant's table, her damp sweater and jeans swapped for a tailored navy blazer and crisp white blouse, hair pulled back tight. No cuffs, no orange jumpsuit, just an unshakable presence that filled the room without her saying a word. Her wrists still bore faint red marks from the night before, but she didn't hide them. They were evidence now, not weakness. Beside her, Lisa Tran flipped through a stack of papers with the efficiency of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. The lawyer, petite, sharp-eyed, and notorious for dismantling crooked cops, didn't waste a glance on the trickle of people filing into the courtroom. A few reporters, a handful of courthouse regulars, and a couple of uniforms lingering near the back. Lisa's focus was absolute, her movements precise, and Maya liked that. No small talk, no fluff, just results. The heavy oak doors at the rear swung open with a groan, and Tom Carver strode in, shoulders squared, chin tilted up like he still owned the place. His uniform was pressed, boots polished to a mirror shine, but there was a stiffness in his step now, a crack in the armor he'd worn so smugly out on 85. He caught Maya's eye as he passed, a quick flicker of gray meeting her steady gaze, and looked away fast. Good. Let him squirm. She didn't move, didn't blink, just watched him settle into a seat near the front, arms crossed, radiating the kind of confidence that smelled more like desperation up close. The judge entered next, a rustle of black robes cutting through the murmurs. Judge Evelyn Hart, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and a face carved from years of seeing through bullshit, adjusted her glasses as she took her seat. The gavel came down once, sharp and final, silencing the room. "All right," she said, her voice a low drawl tempered by impatience. "Let's get this over with." She glanced at the case file, then up at the prosecutor, a wiry guy with a cheap suit and a nervous tick in his left eye. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, clearing his throat, "we're here on behalf of Lieutenant Commander Maya Jackson, who we believe was unlawfully detained without probable cause by Sergeant Tom Carver. Furthermore, new evidence suggests a pattern of misconduct that demands immediate attention." A ripple of whispers spread through the room, heads turning toward Carver, who shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. Judge Hart peered over her glasses at him. "Sergeant Carver, you care to explain yourself?" Carver leaned forward, clearing his throat with a rasp. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. Refused to comply, questioned my authority. I followed procedure." His voice was steady, practiced, but his fingers drummed once against his knee. A tell Maya clocked from across the room. Lisa Tran didn't let him finish. "Uncooperative," she cut in, her tone dry as desert sand. She lifted a single sheet from her stack, holding it up like a trophy. "Lieutenant Commander Jackson's record says otherwise. Naval Academy grad, multiple commendations, 0 criminal history, not even a parking ticket. You're telling me she was such a threat over a supposed taillight that you had to cuff her and haul her in?" Carver opened his mouth, then shut it, the silence stretching like a tightrope about to snap. Lisa kept going, flipping through her papers with a flick of her wrist. "And let's talk about your arrest history, Sergeant. Internal data shows a disproportionate number of stops involving black drivers in your district, 80% over the last 3 years. Coincidence?" The murmurs grew louder, a buzz of unease rippling through the benches. Carver's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. "She resisted," he said, louder now, leaning into the words like they'd save him. Lisa raised an eyebrow, cool as ice. "The body cam footage says otherwise." She nodded to the bailiff, who wheeled in a screen at the front of the room. "Let's roll it." Maya didn't turn to watch. She didn't need to. She'd lived it. The rain-slicked highway, Carver's barked orders, her calm questions met with his escalating aggression, the cuffs snapping on too tight. The room fell dead silent as the footage played, the only sound the faint hum of the projector and Carver's recorded voice, gruff, impatient, dripping with contempt. "Turn around," he'd shouted, and there she was, hands steady on the car, voice level. "For what reason?" Then the shove, the cuffs, his muttered, "You don't know who you're messing with," as he slammed the door. When it ended, Judge Hart leaned forward, steepling her fingers, her eyes boring into Carver. "Sergeant, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your statement. Care to revise your story?" Carver opened his mouth, but Lisa wasn't done. "That's not all, Your Honor," she said, her voice rising just enough to command every ear in the room. She pulled out her phone, tapping the screen with a single deliberate motion. "This is an audio file Lieutenant Commander Jackson's smartwatch sent to my office last night, automatically triggered when her biometrics spiked during the arrest." The room held its breath as she hit play. Carver's voice crackled through the speakers, smug and unguarded, talking to another cop on the radio after locking her in the cell. "Another one of them thinking they're above the law. I put her in her place. Same as the rest. Gotta teach 'em who's boss around here." A pause, then a laugh. "They never see it coming." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, reporters scribbling furiously. Carver's face went slack, the flush draining to a sickly pale. He shot up from his seat. That's out of context." Lisa didn't flinch. "Context?" She turned to the judge, her voice cutting like a blade. "That's a confession of intent, Your Honor. And here's the kicker. Lieutenant Commander Jackson isn't just a Navy officer. She's part of a federal task force investigating police misconduct across the Southeast. She didn't stumble into Sergeant Carver's trap. He stumbled into hers." The room erupted. Shouts from the benches, a gavel banging for order. But Maya stayed still, her eyes locked on Carver. He stared back, mouth half open, the realization hitting him like a freight train. She'd played him from the second those lights flashed in her mirror, calm, collected, letting him dig his own grave while she baited the hook. Her smartwatch, her questions, her restraint. It wasn't defiance, it was strategy. Judge Hart slammed the gavel again, silencing the chaos. "Enough!" Her voice boomed, sharp as a gunshot. "The charges against Lieutenant Commander Jackson are dismissed." The gavel came down, a crack that echoed off the walls. "And Sergeant Carver, I'm ordering an immediate internal investigation into your conduct, starting with every stop you've made in the last 5 years. You're suspended, effective now. Get out of my courtroom." Carver didn't move at first, his fists clenched at his sides, face a mask of red-hot fury and dawning fear. Then he turned, storming toward the doors, boots pounding the floor like he could stomp his way out of this. The uniforms in the back parted for him, their faces blank, but the reporters surged forward, shouting questions he didn't answer. Maya exhaled slow, controlled, as Lisa gathered her papers with a satisfied nod. She'd known this was coming, had counted on it from the moment she'd tapped her smartwatch in the rain, activating the emergency protocol she'd set up months ago for this exact kind of op. She'd seen men like Carver before, watched them flex their badges like shields, but this time he'd picked the wrong fight. As she stood, adjusting her blazer, she caught her reflection in the courtroom's polished table. Steady, unbroken, the same woman who'd stared back from the patrol car's glass. She'd walked into this with a plan, and now Carver was the one running. The twist wasn't just her victory, it was his unraveling, and she'd made damn sure it stuck. The courthouse doors swung shut behind Tom Carver with a heavy thud, the sound swallowed by the buzz of reporters swarming the hallway. Their voices overlapped in a chaotic hum, cameras flashing, mics thrusting forward, questions piling up like debris after a storm. "Sergeant Carver, any comment on the suspension? What about the audio? Are you resigning?" He shoved through them, head down, his polished boots scuffing the marble floor in a retreat that looked more like a rout. The man who'd strutted into that courtroom an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone smaller, hunched, a badge stripped of its shine. Inside a cramped office down the hall, the air was thick with tension and the faint smell of cigar smoke clinging to the walls. Chief Marvin Tate, a grizzled vet with 30 years on the force, stood behind a cluttered desk, arms crossed tight over his barrel chest. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, dark and steady, locked onto Carver like a hawk sizing up a wounded rabbit. Carver stood across from him, fists balled at his sides, the flush still lingering on his neck from the courtroom slaughter. "What the hell were you thinking?" Tate's voice was low, gravelly, cutting through the silence like a blade through meat. He tossed a file onto the desk, a thick stack of papers that landed with a slap. That's your arrest log. 5 years of stops, half of them shaky as hell, and now the feds are sniffing around because you couldn't keep your damn mouth shut. Carver's nostrils flared, his jaw working like he was chewing on a comeback. I was doing my job, he snapped, but it sounded hollow, even to him. She was mouthing off, questioning me. Questioning you ain't a crime, Tate cut in, his tone ice cold. But falsifying a stop? Harassing a federal officer? That's a one-way ticket to a cell. Or worse, a desk job in Nowhereville if you're lucky. He leaned forward, palms flat on the desk, his shadow looming over Carver. The DA's reviewing every case you've touched. Internal Affairs is already pulling body cam footage. And that audio? You handed him your head on a platter. Carver's hands twitched, the fight draining out of him. She set me up, he muttered, almost to himself, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth. Tate's laugh was short, sharp, and humorless. No, son, you set yourself up. You just picked the wrong woman to flex on. He straightened, grabbing a pen and scribbling something on a notepad. You're done here. Pack your desk. Suspension's the least of your worries. Charges are coming, and this department's not syncing with you. Carver stood there, rooted, his world unraveling in real time. The badge on his chest felt heavier now, a dead weight pulling him down. He turned, slow, and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him like a coffin lid. By noon, word hit the precinct. The investigation had widened, dragging 3 other officers into the mess. Carver's buddies caught on old footage laughing about keeping the streets in line. The whole rotten network was crumbling, and he'd lit the match. Across town, Maya Jackson sat at a corner table in a quiet diner off Peachtree Street, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the booths were worn soft from years of stories. Sunlight streamed through the big windows, glinting off the scratched Formica tabletop as she stirred a cup of black coffee, steam curling up in lazy spirals. Her phone buzzed beside her, headlines popping up one after another. Atlanta cop suspended after viral arrest. Federal officer turns tables on rogue sergeant. She scrolled through, sipping slow, her face unreadable. She'd known this would blow up, had counted on it when she'd tapped her smartwatch in that rain-soaked patrol car. The bell above the door jingled, and Lisa Tran slid into the booth across from her, dropping a leather satchel onto the seat. Carver's toast, she said without preamble, her sharp eyes glinting with a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. Suspension's just the start. Criminal charges are on deck, and the feds are moving fast. They've got enough to gut half that precinct. Maya nodded, setting her cup down with a soft clink. Good, she said, her voice steady, final. She glanced out the window, watching cars roll by on Peachtree, their tires hissing on the still damp asphalt. He's not the first, and he won't be the last. Lisa leaned back, crossing her arms. You don't sound surprised. I'm not, Maya said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Men like Carver, they thrive until someone shines a light on them. I just happened to have a spotlight handy. She tapped her smartwatch, the same one that had sent the audio to Lisa's inbox, a quiet nod to the tech that had flipped the game. Her phone buzzed again, a call this time, the screen flashing a DC area code. She sighed, letting it ring for a moment before picking up. Jackson, she answered, crisp and professional. Lieutenant Commander, a familiar voice crackled through. Her task force supervisor, Captain Reese. Hell of a show you put on down there. Courthouse footage is already viral. Carver's done, and the mayor's office wants to pin a medal on you. Maya's eyebrows lifted, but her tone stayed dry. I don't do this for medals, Reese. Tell him to save the hardware. I've got work to do. He chuckled, a low rumble. Figured you'd say that. But heads up. The brass is watching now. This isn't just about Carver anymore. It's a signal flare. They're talking about expanding the task force, putting you front and center. She leaned against the booth, her free hand tracing the edge of her coffee cup. Not sure I'm cut out for the spotlight, she said, but there was a spark in her voice, a hint of something bigger taking root. This isn't about me. It's about the ones who don't have a watch or a lawyer or a voice. Too late, Reese countered. You're in it now, and what you did? It's a damn good start. He paused, then added, one more thing. Got a new lead. Birmingham. Same pattern, different badge. You in? Maya's gaze drifted out the window again, landing on a young black kid, maybe 10, bouncing down the sidewalk, his mom trailing behind with a tired smile. He laughed at something, loud and free, the sound cutting through the diner's hum. She watched him for a beat, her chest tightening with a mix of resolve and memory. Her own brother at that age, her cousins, all the kids who deserved better than a world where men like Carver held the reins. Yeah, she said into the phone, her voice firm. I'm in. She ended the call, tucking the phone into her pocket as Lisa raised an eyebrow across the table. Another fight? Lisa asked, half smirking. Always, Maya replied, standing and pulling on her jacket. She dropped a few bills on the table, enough for the coffee and a generous tip, then stepped outside. The afternoon air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain lingering from the night before. She walked with purpose, her steps steady, head high, the same way she'd faced Carver on that highway. Her phone buzzed one last time, a text from Reese. Birmingham files incoming. Watch your six. She smirked, pocketing it, and kept moving. This wasn't just her win. It never had been. Carver was one domino, knocked down clean and fast, but the line stretched long behind him. She'd fought for herself out there in the rain, sure, but she'd also fought for that kid on the sidewalk, for every name on every report she'd read, every face she'd never forget. Power only worked if you let it, and she wasn't letting it anymore. Here's the truth. Unchecked power is a bully with a badge, and it thrives in the dark. But one voice, one light, can burn it down. Carver learned that the hard way because Maya Jackson didn't just fight back. She fought smart, and she's not done. If this hits you, share it. If it fires you up, say something. Change doesn't wait. It starts with us.